I'm Doris E in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University. I've been thinking a lot about mining and human rights lately, and more specifically women's rights. And the connection between those might not seem obvious at first glance. It certainly wasn't on my research agenda until I started working in collaboration with a fabulous non-governmental organization here in Ottawa and with really bright colleagues in other departments at Carleton and in universities in Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Mozambique. We've come together as a group because we were all interested in looking at the role of law in addressing sexual and gender-based violence and armed conflict. And in the course of that work, we began to look a bit more closely at resource extraction and sexual and gender-based violence. And that started a decade and more research collaboration. Certainly, one of the starting places for us in that work was sexual violence and exploitation. But in looking deeper at the relationship between human rights and mining, we started to unveil a much more complicated story. We found that women in sub-Saharan Africa work in mining in large numbers. Some of them work in industrial forms of mining, the kinds of mining enterprises that you might associate with Northern Ontario or Northern Alberta. But more commonly, they work in small-scale mining, which is a form of mining that's done using more basic tools and at a smaller scale. And we discovered that women working in mining earn much more money from that livelihood than they do from farming. And they pay for their school fees, their children's school fees, and they feed their children with that money. And the story of the human rights dimensions linked to mining starts to look a lot more complicated.
One thing we discovered is that small-scale mining is not that small when we look at the large numbers of people who work in it and rely on it for their livelihoods, and when we look at the place of this form of mining in larger global mineral economies. It was a surprise to me to find a large number of international and transnational laws, policies, and human rights developments all aimed at addressing some of the harms linked to mining, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Harms such as the links between armed conflict and mining, child labor, widespread sexual violence, land appropriation, as just a few examples. In our research, we track both how women in mining may experience and strategize around human rights and exploitation. But we also study the international human rights and mining legal developments themselves to consider how assumptions about women and mining inform, or not, the directions these policies take and their consequent impact on the women in the mining areas that we study.
In the course of doing this research, I've been reflecting on how lucky I've been in doing this work, how fortunate I've been to forge collaborations and connections with non-governmental organizations, with super bright activists, with fabulous colleagues around the world. And those are the kinds of connections and collaborations that I see really valued and supported here at Carleton in the Department of Law and Legal Studies and at the Faculty of Public and Global Affairs.